Hello again, everyone. It's good to have you with us for this event. It figures to be an exceptional one that doesn't need any build-up.
Are you ready? This is the main event of the evening.
Athletes, huddle up. It's time to begin. Get focused. Let's go.
Welcome back to another episode of the Addiction Unlimited podcast. I'm your coach, Angela Pugh. Remember, I am your personal sobriety and life coach to guide you through this journey to rebuild your life, to be happy, and to have fun on this alcohol-free adventure. And if you listen to all of the transformational stories that we share and listen to my solo coaching episodes with strategies on how to deal with all the struggles that come with rebuilding your life, you'll be well on your way to happy, confident freedom, alcohol-free freedom. You hear a lot of people everywhere, really, any kind of healing or wellness of any sort. You're going to hear a lot of conversation about movement, exercise, working out, all of those things. And you may wonder, can movement really help you unlock your full potential? Like, is that really a thing? Does exercise and movement give you a framework to follow? Not only for an alcohol-free lifestyle, but for fulfillment, like to really be fulfilled in your life. Today's guest, Coach Blu, definitely thinks so, and he's here to tell you all about it in this episode. Blu breaks down how to align your passion for sobriety with getting moving and healing your wounds instead of just getting by day in and day out. He's a mental health therapist, host of the Addict II Athlete podcast, and founder of the nonprofit Addict II Athlete, which is an action-oriented organization focused on recreating recovery, one healthy activity at a time. Blu's mission is to establish and maintain recovery by erasing negative behaviors and replacing them with positive ones, so you can learn how to help yourself find inspiration and hope and the support that we all need in this journey. Coach Blu is going to break down the importance of healing and the premise of moving from addict to athlete, but not in the way you may think. So let's dive in. Here's Coach Blu. Coach Blu, what an honor to talk to you again. You had me on your podcast. Awesome conversation. I love what you're doing. So I was really excited to get you on my podcast as well. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. I always love being on this side of the mic. So it's kind of a rare treat for me. So thanks for having me.
It is fun. You're right. Being on the other side of the interview is pretty fun because you don't necessarily get to share pieces of yourself in your story when you're the interviewer. So it is fun to be on the other side.
You're absolutely right. But no, your episode is done very well on Addict II Athlete's platform. And I look forward to reaching out to some of your listeners as well.
Well, why don't we start with just take a couple of minutes and let everybody know a little bit about you and what you do.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Blu Robinson. I'm a mental health therapist and I'm a substance abuse disorder counselor. So I'm duly licensed in the state of Utah to help individuals overcome addiction and kind of get them on a path of recovery. I like to use the word healing in that, and it's not always been the best word to describe because it came with some flack when I started using that. But my story kind of began with a lot of other people who have struggled with addiction, growing up in a very, turbulent family system. I had a mother who was married at age 14. So she was a kid having kids. And, through divorces and moving, she went through 7 divorces and husbands. I moved 26 times before I was 18.
Wow.
And we were kind of in the grips of poverty, and that's a great recipe for addiction. The abuse cycle, the abandonment issues, the neglect, and all that stuff. And so growing up and moving from high school to high school, school to school, town to town, my education really took a hit. And I dropped out of high school thinking that, my life was destined just to be a back-breaking job with alcohol and substances at night. And thank God that didn't happen. There was a huge shift when I got a job working with youth who were having troubles, and it was a residential treatment center for kids. My job was to simply take them to their doctor's appointments and airports and all this kind of stuff. So I was courier. And as I'd get these kids in the van, we'd drive them around, they'd be talking about why they were there. And I was kind of blown away that like these kids have, families, systems that care enough to send them to get help, even though it was a struggle. And I kind of resonated with that. But a man approached me and said, "Hey, you're really good with these kids." He's like, you take them to their 12-step meetings all the time. And he's like, "You should probably look at this as a career." Little known to him, I was a full-fledged, addict back then. I mean, I lied on my application. I'd go home and drink, and I would use substances and all this kind of stuff. But then I started taking the kids to the 12-step meetings, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting. People talk about this stuff out here. So I volunteered to take the kids every day to these 12-step meetings, and I just didn't listen, didn't say a word. No one knew I was struggling, but slowly but surely, I pushed all that stuff away, started to find some purpose and some understanding of why this all happened. And life took a huge turn. I stopped using in the great year of 1996 and, changed some course of direction. But then I found myself being a sober addict. I wasn't using anymore, but I had no idea that the history of abuse, the lying that I had to tell, because every couple of weeks we were moving, I had to make friends fast, so lie real quick because who cares? You'll be leaving next month. And so all these attributes that were holding me back really started to clog up my life. And then I met my wife at that job. She was a rec therapist, and I was a lowly courier, high school dropout. And through the grace of God, I found a path to get into this program, to get my adult education diploma for high school. Went into college and did fairly well there. It was interesting when I found there's a support system between me dating my fiance to my wife and her family. And I came out of the shell. And it's funny enough that my very first day in actual therapy, my therapist, after hearing my story, said, "Yeah, you just don't know who you are." And I thought, that's the dumbest thing ever. So I left. I walked down. I gave him a good day, sir, right? And walked down to therapy. And I went back to my wife. We were dating at the time, and she said, "Well, how was it?" I'm like, "I'm done." She's like, "You can't be done. One session?" I'm like, "He's that good." And she's like, "Well, why?" He said, "Because he asked me a rhetorical question no one can answer. It's one of those dumb therapy questions, and it was, 'Who are you?'" And she's like, "I know who I am." And for the first time in my life, I was 22 years old, she told me who she authentically was. Personalities, the character traits, her morals, her values, her beliefs, all this stuff. And I didn't have any of that. And I was blown away. So I had to go back and apologize to the therapist. And funny enough, that was the catalyst to get me into that line of work. So for the past 20 couple years now, I've been doing that and started a program called Addict II Athlete. It's a nonprofit program that we have here in the state of Utah. And now outside, we have chapters across the country, helping people erase addiction by replacing it with things of greater value like health and recreation, team, relationship support, all that stuff. And it helped me get clean with recreating, running, mountain biking. And so it kind of was a fluke that it took off. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how I got here.
I love that you started working with kids too. I worked with adolescents pretty early in my career, and it was so much fun. I mean, I probably could relate in some of their behaviors a little more than I should have at my age, but
yeah,
like we were on the same page more than I probably was healthy, but it was so refreshing. It really is refreshing to hear kids' point of view and how they process things and how they internalize things. And I feel like it made me, because this is back when I was counseling, and it really made me a much better counselor, even with adults, right? To see all these different points of view. And again, how kids internalize things. It was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was. And the funny thing about it is that was, again, 1997, 98, 99. And I still have connections with a majority of those kids. They're all adults now and they have lives of their own. And it's heartbreaking now too, because, me being a courier, I wasn't a line staff, wasn't in the units with them. I gave them a little bit of a reprieve from that. And so I'd let them listen to music, don't tell anybody, but I'd stop and get them a drink now and then. If they needed to, if they were, want to get a soda or something, let's go. And the thing is this relationship based stuff. And I was just a courier, but I'm like, these guys are already in a lot of hot water. They don't need me barking orders at them. But I hear now the abuse side and the neglect side that they suffered. And I'm thinking, whew, heartbreaking stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do it now. I don't have the stomach now for that, because to be honest with you, I don't really agree with that unless it's a last ditch effort and situation they have to be in. But it did teach me a lot about empathy, about understanding where people are, knowing how to work with youth. And so I would say it's made me a better father, because I had some crap examples of stepdads.
Sure.
I had many of them. So yeah, I owe those kids a lot just to my own growth too.
Yeah, for sure. I feel the same way. What is it for you, like, from how you described your childhood, right? And moving all of those times and step parents and all of those things, obviously that makes a lasting impact on you that in the professional world we would talk about as trauma. What was your journey in your recovery with trauma and getting to a place of understanding you had trauma or treating trauma?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Yeah. The interesting factor about that was growing up, I thought it was normal. I mean, my family system is I have an older brother and sister. They came from a dad, their first marriage at 14. Obviously, my mother can't make that work. It's 14. She's a kid. So that marriage ended. She married another guy who was an alcoholic, and they had my sister. Her name was Jennifer. And, he was a raging alcoholic, and that didn't work. So then she met my dad, who was a guy in the military, I think, and went to North Dakota with him. I was born in North Dakota. A couple weeks later, still the night, she takes all of us kids back to Utah, and so I didn't really get to know that guy at all. And if he was walking down the street, I probably wouldn't recognize him. I just don't know who he is, and so. What I didn't realize is that my mother had a hard time with trauma too. I mean, there had to have been something going on at home for her to be pushed away at 14. But we thought it was normal. I mean, also all of us kids are different last names. We don't really look the same. And we have like my two oldest siblings, they got Polynesian blood in them. So you got these two big Polynesian kids, these two little white skinny kids. And like, you guys are all the same family. But it was this cycle of abuse. She married a guy that was named Paul, and Paul was the devil reincarnated. He used to beat us kids, and put my sisters through hell. And I have scars on my body because of him. And so as I was going to this therapist, and I'm like, hey, this isn't anything new. This isn't anything different. This is what you hear every day. And he's like, Blu, that's not normal. He's like, you didn't have a normal childhood. We would move before boxes were even unpacked. And he's like, that's not stable. You need to have stability. And it didn't really manifest itself until I had my own kids. And I remember my very first daughter, who I was telling you about before we hit record, who's helping us with Addict II Athlete. She's 19 now, but when she was an infant, she's born. I'm carrying her around on a pillow, right? And my wife's like, why are you carrying her like that? I'm like, I don't want to hurt her. And she's like, babies are kind of rubbery. They'll be okay. And I'm like, no, that's not what I meant, because dads hurt kids. And I'm thinking, holding this thing, I'm like, how in the world could I do anything to hurt this thing? And oh my gosh, Angela, it was one of these awakenings, that happened. And so it was a process of me being able to come to terms and understand about how to not hold my mom accountable, because obviously she was hurt and abused too, but she put us through hell. She put us through hell. There were so many issues that I didn't recognize in the moment, but now can look back at it and be like, what was she thinking? She put us in horrible situations. Her and I never had a relationship after therapy, because all I wanted was for her to say, hey, sorry about that, but she wouldn't do it. And so through my own growth of becoming a dad is what really kind of made me understand, like, I guess I had really good examples on parents on how not to be. So I simply switched and did the opposite. And I like to think like I'm a pretty good father right now. I think, all my kids like me. So that's gotta be some money in the bank, right?
You're doing something right.
Yeah.
It's hard, I think, when you have any sort of dysfunctional parent or parents. It's a very difficult thing to reconcile as an adult, right? And especially I know you're talking about your own child. I never had my own kids, but I have little brothers that are 10 and 12 years younger than me. So my teenage years were babies, right? And I was a primary caregiver to these little boys. And I had a similar experience like you're talking about, where it's so overwhelming how much you can love one of these little critters, and And that instinct that you just want to protect them at all costs. Like, I never wanted anything to happen to those babies. And you see just how innocent and amazing they are. And they're just little sponges, and you are fully responsible for that. And in those experiences too, thinking about your own parent or parents who weren't that way or seemingly not that way, right? Whatever dysfunction it may be. For some people, it's emotional, it's mental health issues. For some people, it's addiction. I mean, it could be a million things that your parents can struggle with, but it's hard to have that understanding of how much you can love a baby and try to reconcile how it seems like they didn't feel that way about you.
Yeah. See, and I be honest with you, I'll never wrap my head around that. Years ago, we were at a water park here, in Utah, and I'm taking my two little girls at the time, because I have two boys and two girls, and I'm taking my two little girls, and we're walking up the big ramp to go to the biggest slide. They wanted to go on the biggest slide. And as I was standing in front of them, kind of waiting in line, all of a sudden I feel this little touch on my back, and I turn around, and I knew exactly what she was going to ask. I have a very big scar on my back from a very abusive stepdad. One day he got carried away with the belt and drew blood, and I have a scar there. And my daughter looked at that for the first time. She was probably about 6, and she's like, "Dad, what happened there?" And thank heavens we were like drenched in water anyway, because I'm like starting to get all choked up, and I'm like, I had to turn around and tell this little girl that her dad, who she thinks is Superman, he still bleeds. And here we are on this little ramp going up to the stupid water slide, and I'm having a conversation about how a dad that I had was a little bit heavy with a belt, and when I did something that he didn't like, this is what would happen. And she's giving me the cute little squeeze of a hug, and she's like, "It's all better now." I'm like,
"Aw,
yeah, it is." So it's those kind of weird things that I'm like, she's never gonna have to know that,
right?
And I'll be quite honest with you, because of that, I raised my daughters, specifically because they're the two oldest, to be able to tell me no. And it was kind of an interesting thing. And I used to say this all the time when they were little to my clients and stuff about parent-child relationships. And I'd tell them, I want my girls to tell me no. And so if I'll come down, like the living room's a mess or their rooms are a mess, I'm like, "Kids, you girls, it's time to do your rooms. Let's go." And they're like, "No, Dad, we're doing this." I would often say, "Okay, when you're ready, I'll help, but it's got to get done today, but you don't need to do it right now." And little things like that, like you eat your food. "No, Dad, I'm done." "Okay." And I always would say when I would teach this little principle that because if they can tell their dad no, the idiot down the street has no chance, right?
Amen.
Now, Angela, I kid you not, like several years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, my daughter, she was 12, my youngest daughter, her name's Savannah. Savannah was walking home from a friend's house, and sure enough, car pulls up next to her, tries to get her to come in. She's like, "No, I'm not going with you." And he grabs her and she screams, "Let go of me." And she ran home. And I kid you not, like we were, coming home from work. We got there just within minutes. The cops came. The idiot drives past our house. And my daughter's like, "That's him." Cops go out and grab him. Sure enough, because she was able to say no to me, she wasn't at all in jeopardy to say no to some other idiot. And literally, it was a teenager, high school kid down the street, like that tried it. And when we found out who he was, and I was blown away by that. But the coolest thing was when she went to court, and this is a 12-year-old little girl, because he got arrested, and the judge says, "Will the victim come forward if she would like to speak?" And my daughter gets up there, 12 years old, and she says, "I'm not a victim." And the judge was like, "I'm so sorry." He's like, "Let me explain why we say that." And she gave him grace. She's like, "I want him to get help. He needs to go get some help." And I did not say a word to her about this. This is her decision. And I'm like, man, how easy would it have been for my parents, my mother, even a single mother, to take the time to parent out of inconvenience so that we didn't have to have this stuff. So that's how it manifests now. Right. I mean, can't imagine doing what was done to me to them.
Right. Yeah. Amen. And it is so important to give them that respect at every age. Like, it doesn't matter how young they are, but like I say to my nephew all the time, who's about to turn 4, like I'll say to him, "It's okay to disagree with me. Like, it's okay. Like, if I have to tell you no or say we're not doing something, it's okay that upsets you. I hear you and that's okay. But even when we're angry or upset, we still respect and love each other. But it's okay. You don't have to agree with me just because I'm an adult. Like we can figure it out. And that's so powerful. That was something that I learned working with adolescents too, right? That we do as adults, we have such a tendency to blow them off, to dismiss what they say because we know better. And we do know better. There's no question. Like we do know better and they're not always making the best decisions, but there are better ways to handle it where you're still giving them validation and respect and kindness and really hearing them instead of being dismissive. And, we don't treat them with enough respect, truly.
Yeah. And it was interesting, even as an adult, as I was getting married, my mother was getting divorced from her sixth husband. And, she met this guy that moved to New York State. I didn't see her for a few years. There was a fallout between her and I where she tried to get me to, be responsible for an $800 cell phone bill, like when I was first married. And me having a track record of not being the most honest person, because I had to tell my wife as we were dating, like, I've got issues now. She's like, you need to go get help before we get married. So all of a sudden this phone bill shows up one day right after we're married for $800. And she's like, you have a secret cell phone? This is like 2000. Like cell phones were a big deal back then, right?
Right, yeah.
And I'm like, no, I promise it wasn't me. And she's like, yeah, I've heard that before. And so I call and they'll figure it out that, yeah, my mother tried to put this $800 cell phone bill in my name. And I'd had it. I'm like, I'm done. So I called her up and I'm like, what is this? And of course she's lying to me. Oh, it was your sister that did that to you. I can't believe she would. I'm like, shut up. The guy told me it was you, like your name's on there. And she said, I'm not going to take this. I'm like, you're going to listen to me because I'm ready now to have this conversation. Everything that's bottled up now. I've done therapy for a year. I'm now recently married. This is like 2 weeks after we're married. And I'm like, how dare you? And she said, you be careful how you're talking to me. And she said, because I'll never talk to you again. I said, you be careful because I'll respect that. And she flipping hung up on me. As I was getting ready to tell her, like, Mom, what the crap? She hung up on me. So that really pissed me off.
Yeah.
So, email was kind of still a new thing. So I had to handwrite this letter because I'm like, she can't hang up on a letter. So I flipped and sat and wrote this letter. It's about 8 pages front and back, just written, and it took like 4 stamps to send. But I remember getting ready to send this letter that had everything in it. Like, how dare you? I can't believe you do this. Help me understand why you chose this path for us. And I sent it to her. I didn't hear from her for 7 years.
Wow.
7 years. Right. And 7 years later, I started having kids. Started having my own life. And 7 years later, like I get this little Christmas card in the mail that's like, in the time of Christ, we should forgive one another. And that was kind of it. That was her trying to apologize.
Right.
But it never rebounded. I mean, I would, kind of inquire where she's at, what she's doing, but she was always so just distant and emotionally disengaged that she was actually here once when I was graduating with my master's degree. Now, I'm the first one to ever graduate high school, let alone in generations, to ever go to college. No one thought the Robinsons were going to go to college. And my sister said, hey, Mom's here. I'm like, fantastic. She can come to my graduation. I'll give her that. Like, how cool would that be? Maybe she'll see me finally, right? So I tell her, I get her on the phone, which was a nightmare in process. And she's like, when is it? I'm like, it's Saturday. It's at 10 o'clock. She's like, ooh, I fly out of the Salt Lake airport at 4. I'm like, that's fantastic because the arena my graduation's in is literally like a half mile away from the airport. You could walk there in an hour. And she never showed up for it. And I'm like, noted. And in fact, when she passed away this last August, I didn't even know she was passed for several days because no one told me.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, that was kind of, I think it was her burden to bear. And I know sometimes it's really hard because I'm like, I'm not angry at her. I get it. Like I said, she had to have her own trauma.
Yeah.
But she didn't have to keep replicating it with us. And so my relationship changed greatly. But what it did is it allowed me to be, a father and a husband and a therapist and a coach and so many other attributes. And it's hurt. I mean, every birthday would roll around and that one phone call I wish would come never did. So I hated birthdays. I didn't realize that for the longest time. My wife pointed it out. But I'll be quite honest, like I feel bad because I never got that relationship with her. She chose out. I was ready to have it, but she wouldn't allow herself to engage in it.
Yeah. Would you say that vulnerability or being vulnerable was challenging for you?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Because you don't know. I watch her. I watch her manipulate people and lie to people, and like I'll have your rent due. I'll have your rent by this Friday, but then that Wednesday we're gone, and so that rubbed off on me. And what happened was, I stopped trusting a lot of people, especially men, because, again, men, stepdads were mean, they were abusive. And so, yeah, it took me a long time to kind of like feel emotionally safe enough to even like challenge someone else in a conversation or invite myself into a conversation. And I have to give a lot of credit to my wife. She came from a very different family. Her family saved me. It wasn't just her, it was her whole family. They embraced me. They had to hear the whole story from me because I'd said some stuff before to kind of protect myself that was lies and some mistruths and some distractions, and I had to be accountable to them too. And so it was kind of a cool thing that I could be accountable and that they didn't scream and yell and push away, but they embraced. I thought, that's odd. It took a lot of years, but yeah, I was able to kind of cross that threshold of like, I'll be a little bit more vulnerable. Like, in fact, I didn't even tell the story at all until I was in college, and we had to do a genogram in one of my classes, and I plopped mine up on the board. Everyone was like, "Ugh," and I'm like, "No one's like this." And so it was kind of one of these things where I'm like, "It's okay to talk about this stuff," but yeah, vulnerability and me did not mix.
Yeah, but that's what I was wondering, because all the circumstances you talked about, obviously there's a set of behaviors and emotional responses that will come from those struggles that you endured. And that vulnerability is really, really hard when you are hurt in that way and you have those wounds. Again, where, things like trauma treatment therapy becomes so important to heal that stuff too. And what really made me curious about the vulnerability, because you've been married a long time. And there's no way you can do that without getting comfortable with vulnerability. Like, you have to be able to show those pieces of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was something that really did not come natural at all. In fact, if you look at the family history, my mother married and divorced upwards of 6-7 times. I can't keep track before she passed away. My brother married and divorced 5 times. My sister 6 times. My other sister, 3 times. Then there's me. And I broke the cycle because I finally saw it. I realized that that's not normal. And the vulnerability came because I was sick of running from it. I'm like, what is this? Why is this happening? That's why, as a therapist, I'm also blown away when people come in voluntarily, where they come in, they're like, I've got some stuff on my heart that's heavy. I got to get it off. And it's been one of these things where if it wasn't for, I think, the time, the place, the situation with those youth, with my fiance, my wife now, I would have been pre-planned, destined to have the exact same lifestyle and thought it was normal.
Yeah.
But even talking like this, I mean, I'm part of a religious, church out here, and I went on the radio once, was talking about this, and I was in a leadership position in that church, and the guy's like, he covers the mic. Are you sure you'd be talking about this? I'm like, yeah. Like, half of the people that I go to church with come to my Addict II Athlete meetings, so they all know. Yeah. And it was kind of one of these things where they're like, should you be saying this? I'm like, yeah, we need to be saying this. That's why when I started Addict II Athlete in 2011, I kind of went way against the grain. And in my community, all we had was 12-step meetings. And 12-step meetings were great. Like I said, I got a lot from them. But I started looking at it a little bit different because I'm like, wait a minute, I haven't been using any addiction, anything now for several years. I'm not an addict. It's a part of me. It's not who I am. There's no way I would roll into a meeting and say, hello, I'm Blue, I'm an addict. When, hello, I'm Blue, and I'm a father, and I'm a coach, and I'm a son, and I'm a brother, and I'm a scholar, and I'm an athlete. And yeah, I'm an addict, but it's a part of me. And I'll tell you, Angela, that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way here.
It is. I was the same way. When I got sober, there weren't options. And I love 12 steps, but I'm also very comfortable calling myself an alcoholic. Like, that doesn't bother me. And I think partially because it didn't bother me when I was drunk, right? Like, when I was still drinking, I was already calling myself an alcoholic. So to me, it's just reality, right? And I agree. Like, I always say, we are a 1,000-piece puzzle. And that's just one of my pieces, right? It's not even the biggest piece, but it is a very important piece. Like I have to understand that I have a brain that takes the world in differently and processes it differently, right? I have to have that awareness that is who my brain is, but it's not all of my pieces, it's an important piece and it's a piece I have to acknowledge, but it's not the end all be all of who and what I am.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that mindset. I mean, again, that's why we talk about it. Like on Team Addict II Athlete, you're an athlete, you're an addict moving to an athlete. But that foundation is still there. Like you still have that. So you've got to be careful. People think, well, you can turn, anything can be turned into an addiction. It's true. You can be addicted to working out and athletics and stuff.
Yeah.
But that's why we create the balance. That's why it's like there's more than just athletics here too. And so you're absolutely right. Like, and we have to be aware that it's there because even when I was getting clean through athletics and running and all this kind of stuff, there'd be times when I'd be on my bike and I'd be 80 miles away from home,
right?
Just living it up. And my wife's like, hey, you're getting close. We have the wedding reception in an hour. And I'm like, oh crap. Like even Lance Armstrong couldn't pedal that fast. Like I'm not coming back for another 4 hours. And so we had to have a conversation about how it was. And at first I was in denial. I'm like, it's good for me. It's healthy.
Yeah.
But then I realized like, wait a minute, I'm using this as a crutch. So yeah. I hear you.
Listen, I can take anything too far. There's no question. Moderation is not a natural part of me. I do not moderate anything without conscious effort.
For sure. I love it.
So let's talk about Addict II Athlete here for a minute because I want to understand better. This isn't about becoming an athlete, like a professional athlete, or you don't have to be an athlete to be a part of it. Like, I love you just said you're going from addict moving toward athlete. Explain the premise of Addict II Athlete to us.
For sure. Yeah. When I was dating my wife, and when I went and confessed all my garbage and crap to her parents, her dad said, Blu, he's like, thank you. He's like, how about you come run with me? And I'm like, what does that mean? In fact, when I asked my father-in-law for the hand in marriage for my wife, he's like, yeah, you can totally marry her as long as you run a marathon with me. I'm like, sure, done. And so I went to my wife, like, what do you say? I'm like, yeah, he gave me the green light. He's like, all I have to do is run a marathon. And she's like, dude, do you know what that is? I'm like, He wants you to run 26.2 miles with him. And I'm like, oh, crap. And I committed. But Angela was the coolest thing because as I started getting to know her dad and I started running with him and we go on these long runs, I never had that as a kid. Never.
Right.
Never had the dad that would show up at a baseball game or whatever. Never had a mother that would care or cheer. So I'm running with this guy, that's her dad, and he just subtly started to accept me. We started talking, started running, and I fell in love with it. I ran my first marathon in 2000 in St. George, Utah, and it was the most amazing thing. And for weeks after, I talked to her brother-in-laws about it and her dad about it, and it just became this whole thing. But even before that, in 1996, when I stopped using, had a really bad rock bottom, really scary one that almost ended in me taking my life. And I got that job with youth, and I started making money. And I'm like, this is weird. I have money. And you know what happens when you have money and you have nothing going on, because I'd committed social suicide from all my friends and everything, pushed them all away. My friends literally were Chandler and Monica and Ross and Phoebe. And that's all I do. I'd sit and watch Friends all day, wishing I had some. And I had all this money, so I went out and bought the most expensive mountain bike I could find because I'm like, I got to get rid of this money. And it sat there for wall art for quite a while. And then one day I took it out in the mountains. I'm in the middle of nowhere, no water, no helmet. No, I don't know what I was doing. I was riding a mountain bike, supposed to be in the mountains. And these two guys right up on me, and they're like, dude, are you lost? I'm like, in a lot more ways than one, man. And they're like, follow us down. We'll show you where the trailhead is. And I did. And I watched, and we got down. The guy's like, hey, we come up here every week. He's like, do me a favor. He's like, get a helmet and get some water, man, because like you can't be up here without that. So I thought, they didn't ask me about addiction. They didn't ask me if I was a junk. They didn't ask me about this stuff. They saw a mountain bike, even though I was cut off jeans and a tank top. And they're like, yeah, you're a mountain biker. So that's how I started kind of what I call erasing and replacing. I erased the addiction by replacing it with becoming a mountain biker. And so I did everything a mountain biker would do. I got all that stuff, started riding more. So I was running with her dad. It just became natural. And so with her being a recreational therapist and me going into counseling and therapy, I was working at a job at the Utah County government. I was a government therapist working with these folks. And part of their program in their morning treatment that I was working at was to go to 3 community meetings outside, treatment every week. And they had to have a little sign-off sheet saying they had attended. Well, I come back from lunch one day and I see a bunch of them huddled around the back of a pickup. So I go over there. I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they were forging their sign-off sheets for the meeting. I'm like, how dare you, right? And they're like, Blu, like, it just doesn't work for us. Like, we get it, but like, we're busy. And I'm like, dude, that's addict behavior and all this kind of stuff. And it kind of hit me. I'm like, all they have is that outlet. And if I'm trying to get them to commit to, staying sober and kind of learning these new principles, and they're doing this for 5 hours a day, then they got to go to work and then they got to go to these meetings. When do they have time to be with their families? And so it really kind of perplexed me a little bit. And I thought, running, biking, recreation helped get me sober. I wonder if it would help them. And so I said, hey, you guys want to try something? If you'll come early to group, I'll teach you guys how to run. We'll do a couch to 5K. We're going to register for a 5K race. It's like 3 months away. And the coolest thing was it started literally right out the front doors of our building, this race. And I'm like, so we found the course we'd run. It was called the Chase the Mayor 5K. I went to my bosses and I'm like, hey, I want to try this. And they were like, I don't know, man. They might pass out. They might die. I mean, remember, these are addicts. And I'm like, I know CPR. They'll be okay. They gave me the green light to try this. I went down and asked the 30 people. Only 5 people raised their hands to do this. And so we started this group. We called it Addict II Athlete. We went there. They'd show up early. We'd stretch. We'd talk a little bit. I'd go out and I'd train them. But the craziest thing started to happen is as we were running and training, all of a sudden, they're starting to do therapy with me out here as we're running. And I'm like, what is this? You guys were in my office, my feng shui, like water fountain and dimly lit area where we can just be in emotional, like you guys are brick walls, but out here you're talking. And they're like, I don't know. But we do this every day and we're training for this Chase the Mayor 5K. There was a girl, her name was Janice, and we're training with Janice, and she's running. And she's like, Blu, I got to stop. She's like, Coach, I got to stop. Because now I moved from therapist to coach, right? And she's like, Coach, I got to stop. I'm like, Janice, let's run to that red pickup. It's about a half block down the road. We run to this red pickup. And I'm like, Janice, let's run to the corner. Because I could tell she still had a little step in her. So we run to the corner. And she's like, I got to stop. I'm like, now let's go to that stop sign. She's like, So we go to the stop sign. I'm like, one more, Janice, let's get to that park at the end of the road. And we get there and she stops and just starts bawling. And I'm like, ooh, crap. I'm in trouble. I might have broke her. And she stands up. She's like, why do I always do this to myself? I always give up when I know I have more in me. I always do this. I give up on my family, my kids, my husband. Why do I do that? And I'm like, holy crap. She's like experienced. And I had no idea the connections that she was starting to make she wasn't tired. But her mindset was give up when things get a little bit hard. And she's having this epiphany. And I'm like thinking, is this good? Is this bad? It was things like that. And I was like kind of blown away by it. So here I'm thinking I'm making this whole new modality of therapy. I'm like, this is weird. Like, what's going on here? Day of the race comes, 5 guys show up. Their families come to watch because none of them believe they can do it. You're an ex-heroin addict. How can you just? They gave the mayor of Provo, Utah, who's John Curtis. He's now one of our congressmen in D.C. They gave him a 2-minute head start. And I guess the gimmick was to run by and slap the mayor on the butt on the way by. I don't know. My 5 athletes show up. They say go. The mayor takes off. 2 minutes later, they take off. And all but one caught him. But the craziest thing was before we started, this kid handed out shirts that said Addict II Athlete. And I'm like, ooh, you guys sure you want to wear those? Because anonymity. And they're like, no, we're proud of this. I'm like, okay. As I passed the mayor, the first guy's name was Tyson. The mayor's like, whoa, Addict II Athlete. What's that? And Tyson's like, yeah, I'm in recovery. I'm an ex-heroin addict. And I can only imagine the mayor of Provo was like, how am I getting beat by an ex-heroin addict? Like, I better bump up my training. But all of them but one had that conversation with him. And they came and they finished and I was cheering for them. And they'd never been cheered for like that by complete strangers just because they were doing something. Their families were blown away. And I thought that was it. That was a good experiment. The mayor contacted my bosses at the county and the county commissioners. And I go on Monday and I get called up to my boss's office. I'm like, oh, crap. One of them did something dumb. Maybe one of them peed on someone's lawn. I don't know.
Right.
They're like, hey, Mayor Curtis, talk to us. We love this program. We want you to keep doing it. Will you? And I'm like, yeah, that was in 2011. Now, 12 years later, we've got thousands of athletes, programs all over. It's a nonprofit in and of itself. And what I realized is that running mimics what EMDR therapy does. And I had no idea what that was back then until I got trained on it. And so I use it now in my private practice, therapy and running and stuff, to help people get out of that comfort zone. And they'll do it without even knowing it's happening. So kind of a cool entryway to this. But yeah, it's not about bigger, better, faster, stronger. It's about showing up and having a team support you.
There's such a therapeutic component. Walking is the same way, right? And I read this in a book years ago when I was young, still drunk. Like, it was a long, long time ago. And it was the guy writing a book about all of his different travels, and he had gone somewhere and was with this tribe. And one of his takeaways was whenever they would have an issue, or like a parent would have an issue with a child in this tribe, there wasn't screaming, yelling, grounding, timeout, anything like that. They would take the child and go for a walk. And the guy that wrote the book talked about, he's like, that's when I learned the therapeutic value of walking and how it can break down so many barriers, right? Because, and I tell all my couples, when I work with couples, I tell them to do this, because all of a sudden there's a lot of equality because you're walking side by side. There's not the anxiety and the pressure of looking at somebody face to face when your anxiety is high, their anxiety is high, tension is high. It's a heated conversation. You're disagreeing, right? When you're walking and you're side by side, you're equals. You're on objective ground, right? You're all in equal territory. And you don't have to look at each other, right? Which allows your defenses to come down a little bit. And you're walking, getting that bilateral stimulation, which is what the component of EMDR is. And it's just this beautiful process that allows people to really communicate and connect on a much deeper level. It's incredible.
Yeah, it has been, I mean, all these years later, and, it's still growing. I mean, it was, again, even kind of a gimmick to let me go running at lunchtime even. But it was an interesting thing, too, because it changed the dynamic of me being a therapist with the client. And I talked to our state licensing, who goes over, it's called Doppel, who's over all of our licenses. And I'm like, I want to make sure this is okay, because it could be considered a dual relationship in a few different ways. And the guy up there is like, well, are you forcing them to run? I'm like, no. I kind of think running is for criminals, but, we do it. And he's like, well, then you're fine. And I thought, this is kind of wild. This is a different approach, because we're in therapy in the morning and then we're out here running. But the coolest part was, Angela, the neatest part was that they started bringing their kids, because we started this little meeting afterwards. I thought, well, this is going to work for them. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's make it a little bit more organized. And so we'd come in, we'd have like a 20 to 30 minute kind of conversation. We could crosstalk. We could do everything. We'd talk about recovery. It was independent of the 12 steps, because I respect those and I want that to be that. And did some psych education stuff, did some motivational things. And it was kind of funny because it became such a motivational thing. These kids, these athletes of mine, these clients are bringing their kids. I thought that is a kind of an honor that they feel safe enough to bring their kids here. Because I've seen kids in some meetings and I'm like, but they brought them. And it was kind of cool because now they're having time with their kids. And so they're with the meeting and then they're out running with their kids. That's an hour of just unadulterated time just with them. And so we started the Addict II Athlete Minor League. It's the 18-year and younger group. And this is all we do is support the guts out of these kids. We'll get them into races and events. We'll teach them how to swim. There was one time one of my athletes came up to me and said, Coach, my son wants to play football, but I have all these court fines. I've got all this stuff. He's like, I can't pay it. I'm like, how much is it? I had no idea. To play high school football was like $400. And I'm like, well, you have a team here. Your job, is to have an Addict II Athlete sponsor your kid. You don't need to tell them where it comes from, but your job now is to be the first one to show up at the game and the last one to leave. You bring the orange slices, whatever high school kids eat after that. I'm like, I want you to go be a fan and I want you to be a supporter. And it was cool because we kind of lost that guy because he started hanging out with his kids and doing all this stuff and didn't need the program anymore because he was that person now. And so it was kind of this cool kind of like just buildup of what this can do. And so we do more than just running. We do a ton of service because that's a huge part. So aid stations for races, trail cleanups, speaking engagements. We do a ton of stuff. The court systems love us because it's action-oriented. You can tell if they're showing up or not. We have one at the state prison, which was kind of a crazy experience. I got invited to their first 5K. It was the most exclusive 5K I ever ran because it was 30 loops inside their little out-yard court. And as we're running, the inmates are they're they're free, and one of the guards pulled me aside afterwards and was like, I've never heard them cheer for each other. This is kind of wild. And so there's something about movement that I think heals people. And that was kind of the premise of it.
I love that. That's incredible. Do you think it's important as a helping professional to always be engaged in doing your own work?
100%. 100% for a few different reasons. Addict II Athlete became my full-time job. Like, we did this it's a free community program. You don't make a lot of money when you do things for free. And what happened was I had a big boy job at doing therapy. And then until we got grants last year, we were 11 years and before we got our first grant, it was a dual kind of job. But it was every time I would try to hone it in or maybe do less, something would happen. But what happened was, Addict II Athlete, we've had thousands of athletes, and a few of them haven't made it. And so I remember we had one gal, the very first time we lost an athlete was probably one of the hardest things for me, but the second one was even worse. But the first one, his name was Brandon. And Brandon, I had the first 5 athletes. Brandon was number 6. And, Brandon was a natural athlete. He was just amazing. And we were up at Salt Lake doing this run. And I'm waiting for them to finish, cheer him on. And all of a sudden I see Brandon pop around the corner and he's first. And I'm like, holy crap, one of my athletes is going to win. And we're cheering and there's tons of people. And then I see him kind of stop. And I'm like, what's going on? And he looks over like he's tying his shoe. And I'm like, Brandon, take your shoe off. You're like 200 yards away from finishing. Like, go. And he's messing with his shoe. He's doing something else. Another guy pops around the corner and passes him. I'm like, what? Then another guy and then somebody else. Then he pops up and kind of jogs in. And I'm like, dude, what was that? He's like, you saw that? Yeah, we all saw that. You're right there. And he's all blue. He's like, I didn't want to win. And I'm like, why? Brendan, you were there. Why didn't you want to win? He's like, I didn't want anyone to think I cheated. I'm like, did you cheat? He's like, I don't think so. I'm like, Brendan, if you ever do that again, I'm going to pull you by your ears across that line, But what happened is here's this kid who has been an addict his whole life, who's been downtrodden and pushed away and neglected. And for the first time, he's going to do something amazing. And he didn't want to think anyone thought less of him. So he stopped. He took a knee. And I'm like, how dare you? But it makes a lot of sense, right? It's like, I don't want that because they won't believe me. I'm an addict. And that pissed me off. The next time he did great. He won his race and stuff. And then I didn't see him for a while. And I was up there doing the next race up at the state prison. And I saw Brandon. I'm like, this is where you've been. What happened? And he had gotten in trouble, had a relapse, got caught, tried to run from the cops. He's a pretty good runner, so he got pretty far. But he's like, as soon as I get out, I'll call you, coach. And then the next time I heard from him was at his funeral. He got out, didn't get a hold of us, and passed away. That was hard. But the hardest one was Carly. And Carly was one of my dear athletes. She was so involved with this team. She was engaged with the minor league. The minor league kids loved her. She was so involved. She brought her whole family to this team. And like her mom, her dad, her uncles, her siblings, because she loved it so much. And at the time I was an owner of a treatment center, and she'd gotten in some trouble a couple years later, and we got her into the treatment, worked through some stuff she never worked for before, was doing great, got out, got to my sober living house. And a couple of weeks later, she overdosed on heroin. And that was the day I almost shut this whole thing down, because my impression was, if I can't save Carly, what am I even doing here?
Right.
I had to be the one that called her mom and her dad, who I knew very well, and say, Tyson, Savannah, on my watch, I lost your daughter. Whew. And one of my dear friends, he pulled me aside and said, Blu, you're not God. You don't get to make those decisions.
That's right.
And he's like, all you have to do is keep showing up, because there's hundreds of other people that need what you're doing. That was hard. It was so hard. But I had to, it's like this, Angela. Who heals the healer? I'm the head coach of this whole team. I'm the therapist of this program. I'm the father to my family. Like, who heals me?
Right.
Right? I had to go way to that spiritual side too, and start running again, start biking again, start getting right with myself, start talking to God again, start talking to people that, I thought, oh, you can't help me, you don't know. But like, let people in, because it was getting that old stuff again, right? Those walls we used to build up. I'm like, who can heal me? Like I heal all you people. That was a wrong mindset, and the team healed me. My family healed me, and God healed me. And so one of those things where, you've got to take care of yourself. And so I have to do my workouts. I have to run just to kind of let that stuff go. Because if I'm teaching it and preaching it, I should probably do it. And it works. I'm telling you, it works all the time. But you got to be real with yourself. You can't hide from it. And when the alarm goes off, you got to get up and go.
That's one of my favorite things about being a helping professional is that it keeps me so on top of my game myself, right? Because I feel the same way that you do. Like, I don't ask my clients to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself. I'm in this 150%. And sometimes it seems like people are a little surprised when I'll refer to my coach or my sponsor, and people are like, "You're still doing that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, are you kidding me?" Because you're never problem free, right? It's like some of my behaviors improve and get better in some areas, but as I'm improving those, then they're slipping in other areas. And then I go over to those areas and I focus on improving those, and then other things start slipping. Like, you're never finished. And you're always having life experiences. And life is not easy. Life will beat you down. I mean, it comes at you from every angle every day. So you're always going to have things to work through, and disappointments and bitterness, resentment, and relationships ending, and losing jobs, and deaths. And I mean, you're always going to have life things to work through. And and I love that. It just, my clients keep me so on top of my own game and my own spiritual fitness, and just really being a coach just keeps me so accountable on a level that I've never had before.
You're so right. I mean, that's that to point and check. Like, years ago, one of my very first athletes, the original 5. Like, I was running with him, working with him. He was doing great. His kids were in state's custody for some substance abuse issues. His marriage was kind of falling apart. Through the process of all this, he started getting that back. Well, one day, early on in the team's inception, we were going to go run this little winter run, no big deal. It's a 5K. They call it the icebreaker run or whatever. And, we had a nice warm winter that year. It was like, raining that day. So the day the race happens, I look out the window, I see it raining. I'm like, I don't want to get up and go run in the rain. So I'm a wuss. And so instead of calling my athlete, I text him. I'm like, "Hey, buddy, I'm not going to make it today. But hey, good luck. Throw some pictures up there on Facebook, and good luck." He's like, "Okay, coach." And so later on that day, I sleep in, get up, do my thing. Later that day, I see the picture, and the picture is him standing next to his daughter, recently returned from the state. And I'm like, because I was afraid to get wet, I missed the whole reason he was doing this.
Right.
And I had to go eat some humble pie, and I had to say, "Hey, man, I'm sorry." I said, "The next race you want to do, I'm all in." And so he's like, "Okay." He's like, "I want to do the Pony Express 50 miler. I'm like, "Excuse me?" I'd never run over a marathon, and I never planned on doing an ultra run, but I made a promise. And literally, that next October, here's he and I and all of our team supporting us. And we ran our 50-mile ultra marathon. And I thought, there's something to your word and keeping it like that. And,
right.
He made me an ultra runner. I was never going to do that. But because he wanted to do it, and I, graciously offered my soul to him, I became one. And that was like, now the Jedi and the Padawan, right? I'm like, he's teaching me things. But like you said, out in the middle of this Pony Express 50 miler, mile 30, it's flat as a pancake out there in the West Desert of Utah. And you look like you can see the ending, but it's so far away. It's like the horizon. And I remember a good friend of mine taught me this principle about, we're always moving, like you said, we're always moving to that horizon. If I'm like, we're gonna get to the horizon, and that's gonna be the end, right? Just get to the horizon. But once you get to that location, that spot, the horizon moves.
Yeah.
And you could see it in this huge void, this gap in between where we started and the finish line. And I was out in the middle of nowhere, and I'm like, this is crazy. This is what we're talking about. I always want my athletes, my family, myself to go to the horizon, but it's going to change. But you can always turn around and see how far you've come. You can see those roadblocks in life, those monuments in life, the time that you did that or the time you did this, when you turn around and look how far you've come. So it's one of those concepts, like you just said, about keep moving forward. There's always going to be something, but it's never truly over.
Mm-hmm. There's no finish line.
Nope, there's not.
Blu, what a great conversation. Thank you again for coming on and talking to us. For everybody listening, I will link Addict II Athlete in the show notes so you can get there right from your podcast app. And Blu, thanks again. I appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
You've reached the end of another great episode of the Addiction Unlimited podcast. Candid and honest conversation about addiction and recovery. Be sure to visit us at addictionunlimited.com